We're all set. Okay. Welcome everybody. My name is Adam Lashinsky, and I am the A.M. Rosenthal Writer in Residence at the Shorenstein Center this term. That's the first time I've spit that out publicly. So thank you. Welcome to all of you. I'm here with Susan Glasser, staff writer at the New Yorker and Washington columnist for NewYorker.com. And this is the first in the series that I'm doing on what I've called political communication, by which I mean political columnists and presidential speechwriters. The reason I'm doing that is because I'm writing about a very famous presidential speechwriter and Washington columnist, William Safire. So I thought it would be fun to bring to campus writers who write in that tradition. Just to give you a sense of the conversation that I hope to have, I want to accomplish two broad goals. I want to talk craft and technique and sort of inside baseball journalism with Susan a little bit, because she's one of the best practitioners there is, and it's a great opportunity to hear about these things from her. And then I want to talk about Washington. I love to run these types of sessions as informally as possible. So I'm going to reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A, both in the room and online. But if you feel like you absolutely can't wait to ask your question, please raise your hand, and I'll get you in earlier, and then we'll go back to whatever it was that we were discussing. So Susan, welcome. Thank you very much for coming.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Adam. I have to say, I am delighted to be here. Your framing of this is a little bit intimidating. I have to admit,
Because I have you set as the heir to William
well,
Safire.
exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. My father used to, literally read Sapphire every week, twice a week in the Times when he came out, and sort of in a hate read kind of way, but nonetheless, he was a formidable figure. I'm really excited for your book
Thank
and
you.
delighted to be back with Adam, who was our fantastic moderator in September when my latest book, The Divider, came out, and we happened to be in California on the publication day. So, I have very good feelings associated with that, and know what a great interlocutor Adam is. So I'm glad that he's going to be doing this series here at Harvard this year.
Thank you. I want to say you're formidable too. No less so from my historical reading than Sapphire. When Susan says we, of course, she's referring to Peter Baker, her husband, who she co-wrote that book and two others with. And I just have to start by telling you all, if you don't know, that the day that I interviewed them, they were dropping off their son at Stanford for the beginning of his freshman year of college. I was leisurely reading the New York Times this morning, and I would love it if you would tell everybody what I saw in the New York Times today, Susan.
Well, he's indulging me in a moment of proud parenting. But yes, this is the moment at which you become not just yourself, but also the parent of. And it turns out that my son has started writing for the Stanford Daily, and yesterday, amazing news, became the first ever student to win a Polk Award, which is one of journalism's highest honors. So
For exposing a really interesting scandal regarding the president of Stanford, not just the first student, but the youngest ever recipient
yeah,
of the Polk
the,
Award.
the admissions office, I'm sure, is reconsidering their decision. But
But I mean, how amazing! You have two journalists in their prime of their career whose son has just won a very major award, and it's very exciting. So let me start sort of
as you can tell, journalists are good at log rolling for other journalists. So I appreciate that.
Well, frankly, that's part of my goal with the series that I want to do, because I'm happy to criticize journalists and to talk about all of our faults and problems, but I also am sort of a very proud member of and defender of the fraternity. And so, I don't subscribe to the school of thought that journalists are bad or that journalists can't be trusted. Some are bad, some can't be trusted. But so I do like to support my fellow journalists. And let's go right there, Susan. Let me start, very high level, and I'll sort of push you to drill down. But give me your thoughts on the state of Beltway journalism, which is I don't know, a practice unto itself in the journalism world.
Yeah, that's right. I think it really is a sort of a particular genre And it is one that has really been transformed in a radical way. So, the national conversation is understandably extremely alarmed over the decline of local journalism and the dwindling of news sources at the state and local level. And I think that is a crisis for the country as well as for individual communities that are no longer well served. That is not really the problem in Washington, where a different kind of paradox has applied in recent years with the fragmenting of the media. Actually, more and more players have come into Washington reporting and actually transformed it in a kind of a different direction. And I sort of began my career at what I would say is sort of one of the early phases of that in Washington. I went to Harvard and I graduated in 1990, and I started working right after that at Roll Call newspaper, which covered Capitol Hill, still does today. This was at the very beginning of sort of the internet age. It was actually before news organizations had websites and the like, but it was just coming. It was happening over the next few years. And of course, with the coming of that came the splintering and the fragmenting of coverage. And so you didn't just have, kind of the Washington Post and the New York Times and Time Magazine, and sort of a handful of national TV networks, but a whole host of specialty publications cropped up. And of course, there's an enormous financial interest in so many companies and, so many political entities, unions, and the like have a stake in what happens in Washington. And so money didn't disappear from Washington coverage; it flooded into it. And so you had new actors, and I've sort of watched this whole wave develop. It's a real transformation. And so, as I look at where things are right now, I would say that the quality, not just the volume, but the quality of reporting about Washington in many respects is far better than it ever was before. And I know that that's a little bit of a counterintuitive take for many of you probably, but the truth is that when I was a young kid, just out of school trying to cover Congress, um, the people today know way more about Congress. They are way more competitive. They are incredible, actually. They're like covering it in real time. Some of my former colleagues from Politico started this organization called Punchbowl News. These guys have scoops like literally minute to minute in ways that were not only unfathomable to me when I was just covering Congress, but I couldn't have done it. I mean, they're way better at it than I am. And so um, a different set of problems applies, and that sort of gets to kind of where I see my role these days. But it's overwhelming. And so
Hmm.
we have, I think, a different challenge in Washington, which is, a challenge of hierarchy and
Hmm.
what matters and how do you sort through all this unbelievable loud volume of noise surrounding our politics and get to, an understanding of where things are really at. And obviously, we're doing that in a crisis moment in a way for American politics.
What a fascinating point. You used a great phrase recently, and I'm going to refer to a bunch of great phrases that Susan has written recently because she's a wonderful writer. You referred to the Washington newsletter industrial complex, and that's what you're talking about, I assume. Punchbowl is a new member of that. Um, I think back to when you and I started. There was Congressional Quarterly, there was Roll Call. They were, you can think of them as trade publications, but they were writing on the nitty gritty of Congress. Um, so what what is so describe a little more what you said, what's problematic. You said there's maybe too much, or maybe what is, or sorry, I'll ask it a different way. What are you trying to accomplish given that environment?
Well, that's right. I mean, the risk here, of course, is the risk with a lot of areas that people are interested in. It's the tidbitization of the news,
Yeah.
and which of any of these tidbits are you, supposed to understand, or which actually are important. And that's always been true, right? There's always been a need for a columnist, and for somebody who's sort of stepping back or offering a kind of how does it all fit together perspective. But I think it's even more urgent in this uh, kind of overwhelming amount of information, trying to make sense of it. And, it can also lead you to some very wrong headed conclusions. First of all, just if you just think you're just going to kind of read all this stuff and figure it out, I'm constantly surprised by how when I'm engaging, say, with my editors in New York at the New Yorker, or, people outside, you might have a lot of access to information now, but you're not necessarily, why is this conventional wisdom the way that it is? How does this why is this shaking out the way that it is? Why do these politics don't make sense to outsiders, especially because we're also living in this hyper partisan moment where people tend to view, and this is of course on the left and the right and the middle, people look at these news tidbits through the frame and the filter of their own ideological lens. And that
Mm,
can lead you to some very wrong conclusions.
mm,
It's why many people, myself included, at first did not understand that Donald Trump actually could become the president of the United States. And on from there. But I think it's a huge challenge right now.
ask you a personal question that's related to this. I told you I've covered Silicon Valley for 25 years, and I've grown I've grown tired of Silicon Valley, to say the least, which is why I'm very excited to be writing a book that has nothing to do with business or Silicon Valley. How do you feel about Washington, D.C., having spent almost all of your career there?
Yeah, that's right. Basically, aside from a couple of tours as a foreign correspondent, really have spent almost the entire time since I left Cambridge in Washington. It is a much more exhausting pace to be a journalist. First of all, it is a 24 hours a day. Everybody, is a wire service writer in
Hmm.
some ways, especially like my husband, who is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. I mean, there were many mornings during the Trump era where literally he couldn't get out of his pajamas before he'd already written, two or three stories about, various early morning tweets sent by the president. And even if you say, well, that was exceptional, which it was, the Biden era has not been quite so round the clock. It speaks to a real, transformation. People don't really have time to think anymore. They don't interact with each other as much anymore. It's a very hostile environment. It
Hmm.
is a very, optics driven
Hmm.
environment, an ahistorical environment. So it's kind of an unpleasant place. We had this idea that we were going to break away and re-experience being foreign correspondents again at the end of 2016. And I was the editor of Politico. I was going to finish out the cycle and join Peter and our son Theo, who were already in Jerusalem. Peter started working as the Times bureau chief there, and then Donald Trump got elected. And I knew enough about the way that Times worked to know that they would want their chief White House correspondent back. If you're going to blow up the White House, it's quite useful to have people around who understand what it's supposed to work like in order to be able to really discern, what it means when someone comes in with the intent of disrupting it. So I made it for 3 weeks, more or
Ah,
less. But it's a
I didn't
very
know that.
it's a very negative time in American politics, and it's not as fun as it used to be. I would say
Hmm.
that's for sure.
Hmm.
I know that probably sounds like some kind of old fogey lament, but I I guess that's what I am.
Well, maybe yes, maybe no. I think it's an honest assessment, and I just want to make sure you understand something Susan said about everybody's a wire reporter now, and what she means is there was a time when many journalists, certainly at the New Yorker or the New York Times, were not writing 3 stories a day. They were writing maybe once every month or once every 3 months. And what do you have techniques? Hacks, they call them in Silicon Valley, to try to slow down or rise above
Well, I think that's the origin actually of this current column that I've been writing for the New Yorker since 2018, uh, which is really, I think, was an exercise in trying to, it still lives within the news cycle, but trying to follow the arc of a week, which has many of its ups and downs, and to try to not, be another kind of quick take, especially, this was a response to the feeling of an overwhelming, almost news meltdown of the Trump era. And I think that, my idea was, hey, let's have something it's a column. I'm saying, in a forthright way what I think, but it's not an ideologically driven exercise. I'm not interested in telling you what kind of healthcare system we had. I'm trying to call things as I see them, but I'm not trying to filter, what's happening through the lens of what I would like to happen, or, opportunistically kind of picking this, that, and the other thing. I hope that it's a guide in a way, to help you make sense of, the craziness, and that certainly was the origin of it.
Mm.
So it's reported, it's informed by being rooted in the place, but also because I think a record of this, and how political stories unfold and how this tide washes over, uh, the city each week. To me, that's really, even more important now.
I want to push you on the subject of ideology, and I want to ask the question that in the simplest way. You said you're not taking an ideological perspective, but number one, how would you define your personal ideology, and to what extent do you want that reflected in what you write?
Yeah, I mean, look, I sure it's ideological. Everybody has an ideology, even if you're proclaiming that you don't have one. I do believe that. The column is pro democracy. The column is pro the Constitution. It's pro the idea that we exist, as a country and have a certain, sort of rules of the road that are shared. Um, I'm definitely not cheerleading for civil war. But beyond that, it's not, I don't see it as sort of putting my finger on the scale one way or the other to uh, argue for or against the ideological fights that I am writing about. What I more than anything want is to be right. I would really like, in the end, it's hard to do, but to sort of say, hey, I'd like to flag this running thread because I think it matters. I wrote last summer, for example, before the midterm elections, which were widely expected to be, sort of this kind of massacre for the Democrats. And certainly history strongly suggested, that Democrats were going to lose one or both houses of Congress. And I had felt, I had heard more and more kind of conversation suggesting, well, wait a minute, there's a possibility both because of Roe versus Wade having been thrown out, and also because of the kind of extreme Trumpist direction of many of these, Republican nominees in key races, that might not be the case. And I wrote a piece that was sort of the case for a not awful election in the fall. It's
Hmm.
not an ideological case. I was sort of quoting people, but trying to help people understand
But
what's happening.
not awful from the Democrats'
Right. No,
perspective.
no,
Yeah,
that was what it said.
yeah,
It said
yeah, yeah,
for Democrats, the case
yeah.
for, like why it might not be an awful
So,
race.
so Susan, let me push you. Let me play devil's advocate with you. I'm gonna read something you wrote in your column about the President's State of the Union speech, and this is a sentence, two sentences about the Republican response. You wrote, "The dystopian Republican response later in the evening from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the Arkansas governor and former Trump White House press secretary, peddling Fox News talking points about the culture wars and portraying Biden's America as an American carnage style hellscape conjured from her former boss's Twitter feed only reinforced the point that was the criticism of the president." Now, if I'm a mildly MAGA Republican, or even just a Republican or a Fox News enthusiast, I read that and I see you as forcefully on the left side of the equation as Sapphire was forcefully on the right side of the equation.
Well, I thought it was a good line. Uh,
That's
eh,
why I read it. I thought it was wonderful.
Look, you know what? First of all, I actually do take strong issue right now with the idea that our politics can anymore be, sort of broken down and kind of right and left. Some of the most, I think, principled and articulate and clear-eyed opponents of, what's happened to the Republican Party are very, very conservative people. And in fact, there's an interesting kind of social science argument around that, the sort of never Trump, right, the people who are writing in the Bulwark, for example, that, in social science terms, right, it's this idea that they're untethered, unshackled from ideology, and that makes them actually much more clear-eyed analysts. I
Mm,
have found that to be the case. You
mm,
will find, and by the way, like somebody like Bill Kristol, who was for years my whole career in Washington was actually one of its most ideological players. He was Dan Quayle's
Mm.
chief of staff. He was, always a kind of had a mission in mind. He was kind of famous, actually, and multiple publications I ran used to ding him for giving the worst predictions in Washington. And the reason is that people who are very, very ideological give bad predictions because they are using those predictions in their bully
Right.
pulpit to shape outcomes, right?
Mm.
Or to sort of point in the direction they want things to go, even if they kind of know that it's not gonna. Bill Kristol used to give bad predictions. Guess what? He gives good predictions now. And it's not because I like what he has to say. I mean,
Yep.
he has become more liberal. There is a group of the never Trumpers who have kind of like are actually kind of Democrats now because they've moved, across the spectrum. But not all of them. The real thing that I notice about people who are kind of giving it to you more straight is the ones who are, kind of not beholden to an outcome. Like, there are a lot of analysts on the left who literally I don't know, they cannot take any criticism of President Biden, the White House. It's as if, like the mere act of criticizing Biden will somehow guarantee that Donald Trump returns to the
Mm.
White House. And it's a really striking feature after 4 years of uh, the shoe being on the other foot, so to speak. It's been fascinating to watch how they can hardly handle journalism doing what journalism does. It's a long-winded
Yep.
answer, maybe, but I just I take your point. I'm not. I don't see Fox News as being news, and I don't see this as being. I think part of the challenge is that we're not operating anymore in a world where we can be like, well, you're not. You actually have an ideology if you don't say that. There's a Democratic and a Republican point of view on every single statement. I think that's not operative anymore.
I knew you could take the provocation. Thank you. I'm going to exercise restraint, and I'm going to go to Biden before Trump. So the conventional wisdom is that President Biden will run for reelection, that he'll announce soon. So first of all, let me ask you if you can validate that conventional wisdom, and I'd like to hear your predictions. How will that race go? Who will he run against, and who will win?
Well, one thing to say about all my time in Washington is that you learn quickly that the conventional wisdom is always wrong. You just don't know which part of it and at what point. And so you could actually flip that axiom around and say, well, the conventional wisdom is always right before it's wrong. At the moment, Joe Biden is definitely running for reelection. In fact, he remarkably, more or less has cleared the field as incumbent presidents do. And
Hmm.
and this is despite very strong misgivings among Democratic voters and independent leaning, Democratic voters who really don't, are concerned. They're not concerned about, I would say, Biden's record. They're not concerned about his leadership. They're concerned about one thing alone, and that's his age. And it's an enormous risk factor for the country. He's already 80 years old. If he runs and wins a second term, he would be 86 years old at the end of his second term, and that is putting in a big amount of risk into a political system that already is in crisis. And so I think that that's a big factor. But he seems to be plowing ahead, and largely, I would validate the reporting that I'm sure many of you have seen, that one of the concerns is that the vice president, Kamala Harris, has not really consolidated her position as Biden's heir. And there are fears both inside the Democratic Party about that. The view is that if Biden were not to run, or to become ill or whatever, that there would be almost a wide open primary, that it
Hmm.
wouldn't be Harris's just to walk into.
Hmm.
And the Democrats are concerned about having a messy and divisive primary fight when they're facing the potential return of Trump. And then there's also the factor that Republicans who didn't really focus on Harris that much in the
Mm.
2020 election campaign, that they're really planning to make attacks on her a signature of their 2024 campaign.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you specifically about the vice president. You said something in the New Yorker has a podcast called the Political Scene, which is excellent. And is it always you, Evan Osnos, and Susan Mayer? Sorry, and Jane Mayer.
Yeah, so every Friday we've
Yeah,
just started doing this, and it's been
it's really
great
good.
fun. We sort of have a conversation among my two colleagues in the Washington bureau. Yeah.
I was before I heard the comment that I'm going to prompt you to tell everybody about. I was set to question you on another piece of conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is that Kamala Harris is weak. She has no chance of being president on her own merits. And I was gonna argue to you, well, what does a vice president ever do that distinguishes them? They all have this issue. But you said something on the podcast about what the people around her think that is the most interesting thing I've heard anybody say on the subject. Could you share that with
Uh-oh.
everyone?
People say a lot of stuff on podcasts. So.
Yeah, I'll remind you if you don't remember.
No, I do. And here's the interesting thing. I kind of had that view as well. But having spoken with a lot of people who work in this White House with Harris, including very senior people who work directly with her and for her, I was really stunned. In particular, there was recently Peter and I had a senior official over to our house, and this is someone who was not one of the people dumping on Harris, right? He's not like one of those anonymous background quote givers saying she's not good, and yet it was probably the most damning thing I've ever heard someone in Washington say, given that we were having an off the record conversation. Um, Throwaway line: would Harris, make a good president if, the president, God forbid something should happen to him soon, could happen at any moment, and she was the president tomorrow, we'd be all right, right? Dead silence. We were just shocked. And I think that speaks volumes. Again, this is not a hater. This is somebody who thought that Harris was smart, competent, obviously talented. She'd gotten where she is in life. Clearly, they don't see her as being ready to step into this really important role. And I think that is an example where the account is coming from inside the room, right? We used to say that about Trump, right, in the Trump White House. All of these stories about the Trump White House, and obviously Peter and I filled a whole big book with them recently.
A big book.
You know, not coming from Democrats who hate Donald Trump, right? These are accounts, firsthand accounts from people who worked with and for and alongside Donald Trump, who were willing to work in the Trump administration. All that stuff about him comes from people fundamentally who are Republicans, who were willing to serve in the Trump administration. And I have to say that's the same thing that's the case here with Harris. These are all basically accounts of people who want her to succeed, who worked alongside her, and that's where this is coming from.
And I think what drove home to me, there's this other canard about her that she doesn't really have the experience to be president. She has no less experience than Barack Obama had
That's
when
correct,
he
yeah.
when he became president. But nobody ever said that about it. People said plenty of other things, but not that.
Yeah, I don't doubt that there is a certain amount of both sexism and racism, absolutely, that informs overall perceptions. But I will say that just I have my own skepticism, in fact, in approaching many officials in the Biden administration when I've talked about this issue with them, and yet I've been really struck. The phrase that you often hear is, "Well, she doesn't put in the work. She hasn't grown in the role for whatever reason that is." And believe me, the vice presidency has a long tradition of being a terrible job. Go and read Robert Caro's volume in which he talks about LBJ and the vice presidency. And this is LBJ obviously was one of Washington's most experienced figures at this time. He was been used to, in fact, being at the pinnacle of power as Senate Majority Leader, and then becomes vice president and is so miserable. You read that and you think, my God, he's about to kill himself.
Yeah.
And then he acts, like suddenly through this horrible assassination becomes president and is transformed. So I wouldn't rule out, by the way, that something terrible could happen and Harris could become president and she could be transformed. I actually think that is definitely possible. And people are ruling it out. Washington, where do people make the biggest mistakes is by assuming again and again and again that what is the reality today will likely be the reality tomorrow and next week. That is a safe prediction but it's also the way to be really wrong because
Super interesting.
boom, right? Like
Yeah.
think about like the war in Ukraine a year ago. If I just told you a year and 3 weeks ago, well, Sweden and Finland are going to be in NATO, and we're going to be, running out of ammunition. We're supplying so much money to Ukraine, and we'll spend $50 billion instead of fighting over $1 billion. And the Russian military will collapse, and all these other things. You wouldn't have believed it.
I want to coming back to Harris for a moment. I want to pivot to the subject of women in particular. You've written about recently that. Well, I'll let you say what you've written recently, and maybe if I wonder if hearing everything you just said and knowing your frustration at the place of women in politics in the United States, if you feel conflicted about what you just said about Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I mean, look, that again, it's our role, I think, to be as reality based and clear eyed as possible about the politics, which is often very hard to do. Um, it's a paradox, I think, of the moment that women obviously are closer to the presidency than ever before. We literally could have a woman president tomorrow, and yet at the same time, the overall goal somehow seems quite far off. The politics have shifted. There was recently a moment where we were speaking with a very senior, respected Democratic official, someone who's often mentioned as a possible presidential candidate, who said, absolutely not, no way will I be running for president because a woman can't win. And I think there is, again, the conventional wisdom is often wrong, but I do think in the kind of post Hillary moment and especially in the Trump movement we've been living in, there is a resignation about this issue. This is different than what I have felt really at any time in covering politics. Ironically, when I graduated from college and first went to Washington, women were 2% of the United States Senate. And in fact, in 1992, the first election after I graduated from college, it was the year of the woman, because 4 Democratic women ultimately ended up winning election, right? And so we were cheering and saying, great, it's the year of the woman when there's 4% in the Senate. Well, the truth is, if I had told my 1992 self 30 years later, okay, great, we have 24% of the US Senate, 27% of the US House, 12 women governors out of 50. We just had another milestone in your world. Women, as of January of this year, became 10% of the CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies. You know what? In 1992, I would not have been cheering if you told me, woohoo, women are going to be 10% of CEOs, they're going to be 1/4 of Congress. That is not a good record. It is not a good record. And especially, I think, in the context of what happened in 2016, there really is a view that, how many millions of Americans, and a lot of people say, well, no, Hillary Clinton, I just didn't like her, whatever. You gotta look at it. I think if you pull back and look a little bit more dispassionately, it's hard not to conclude, that millions of Americans were more willing to vote for Donald Trump for president and to support a woman whose policies and politics they agreed with much more.
Listening to you talk, I'm just sitting here thinking, I think you're clearly right about the conventional wisdom, and you've made the case. And I hope this is one instance where it becomes wrong.
Well, again, it literally could be wrong tomorrow.
Yep, understood. And you had a particularly, I thought, trenchant line, and you wrote a piece about, or you wrote about and talked about Nikki Haley's announcement, which was widely panned across the media, and as one of your podcast partners noted, panned in the Wall Street Journal editorial page as well. But you made the observation that Don Lemon of CNN notwithstanding, by and large, the conversation was not about her being a woman. The conversation was about her weakness, her weaknesses. And you wrote, "Is this what counts as progress?" So let me ask you. I mean, let me make the case. Yes, that is progress, that she's not being panned for being a woman.
Yeah, it could be, sure, but talk about incremental progress.
Fair enough.
The Republican politics, running in a Republican primary for president, present a really different challenge for a woman candidate than running in a Democratic
Hmm.
primary or running even in a general election. And the numbers reflect that kind of partisan gap in attitudes about women's leadership. There actually is a real difference. And so Nikki Haley is kind of treading a really almost impossible line, both by being a woman and also being a woman of color in a party where she had to quickly disavow, in fact, and say, while listing her attributes as a child of immigrants who've done well, as a woman and South Carolina's first woman governor. So she's checking all the boxes off in case that's a selling point for some people. But then she has to quickly disavow it. And she then says immediately, well, I don't do identity politics. I'm not
Hmm.
into identity
Hmm.
politics, right? Because in the Republican Party, that's become a dirty word. That is somehow a turnoff to voters. And so, what you hear is it's a kind of a spin on, traditional Republican politics in which um, you will get enormous pushback if you do an interview with a Republican politician today. And they'll say, the liberals, they say we're racist. They say we're sexist. I don't like that. I'm not a racist. I'm a colorblind. And, right, that's actually a different conversation than you would have had 20 or
Hmm.
30 years ago. But the bottom line is that the numbers are very clear that Republicans are not super eager to vote for a female presidential candidate, in fact, far less so than Democratic counterparts.
It occurs to me, it reminds me listening to you that in so many ways we're actually in worse shape than we were in 1992. I mean, when Carly Fiorina ran for president, she's someone I know, and so I found her candidacy preposterous. But to think of Donald
So
Trump,
did the voters.
yeah, right, and that yeah. Anyway, again, like that's the problem of knowing someone. But um, I can't remember exactly what Trump said about it. I think he said she had a
Amazing.
horse face or
Yeah.
something. I mean, it's just awful, and he got away with it. He got away with it.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, it's important, I think, to step back and, especially each week, I would face the challenge and still face this challenge of writing about events that are more or less shocking, even if they're no longer surprising, right? And of course, it is still shocking, even now, 5 years later, 6 years later. It is, in fact, shocking that we've gone down the road that we've gone down in our politics. And,
Yeah.
it's important not to lose that sense, I think, of wow, we've spiraled downwards as a
Hmm.
country. And yet, of course, if you live in that headspace all the time, it can be a pretty, kind of stressful and maybe not even productive headspace to live in.
I did ask you a question that I'm going to follow up on now, which is, the media, as it does, has already nominated Ron DeSantis as the Republican nominee in 2024. But you wrote recently that, in fact, Trump is the front runner, and so remains the front runner. And so, how do you how are you thinking about the race today? I understand it's just today we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, look, on the one hand, right, there's history would suggest that early uh, perceived front runners don't always do well, especially in large crowded primaries. Obviously, we're not sitting here having after action reports on the Scott Walker presidency or the Rand Paul presidency, all
Howard Dean presidency.
exactly who were leaders early on. Um, that being said, and I don't rule out that Trump absolutely could lose. There is a palpable sense of some of the air being let out of the balloon. Many Republican office holders and elected officials who've been wary of criticizing Trump up until this point, their ambition has now gotten a hold of them again, and they are looking and probing to see whether they might break out. But I think that's where, by the way, politicians like Nikki Haley or Mike Pompeo or Mike Pence face an enormous battle. They are not going to win because if you have a choice between, a Trump servant or Trump himself, who are you going to pick? Of course, you're going to,
go with the real
you're going to
thing.
go with the real thing. You're going to
Yeah.
go with the real thing. So that I think we can safely say that the question there is, will a large and crowded Republican field produce, as it did in 2016, an outcome in which a minority of very passionate Trump superfans are able to be the decisive
Hmm.
plurality in a crowded Republican field. That's how he became the nominee before. People forget and are marveling over, the Republican establishment's criticisms of Trump. Actually, their criticisms of Trump were much louder
Yeah.
and more assertive and
Right.
more vociferous
Right.
in 2015 and 2016.
More
And look,
declarative. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Today, in fact, they're still kind of scared of him.
Right.
And, the national polls, many of the state polls still suggest that Trump has a pretty strong lead.
I've reached that point in the interview where I'm very frustrated because there's 18 more topics I want to talk about. Before I turn it over to you, one last question for Susan, which is in 2005, please pay attention to that year, 2005, you and Peter wrote a book called Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution, predicting that democracy was on its way out in Russia. So unfortunately, things have played out as you saw it. I'd love to know your wisdom on what happens next. In particular, do you or do the people you talk to have any sort of crystal ball on when this horrible war, which is what today's the 21st, so I guess we're 3 days away from the 1 year anniversary of when this will end and how?
Well, Peter and I, we happened to become the Washington Post bureau chiefs in Moscow right during Putin's first term in office, which was a very foundational period for the Russia that we're seeing today. This was when essentially Putin was rolling back the democracy that had sprung up in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, which at that time was only 10 years earlier. It was an imperfect, very flawed democracy, but it was one nonetheless. And what we saw was a pretty systemic way of going about that. And I also think, it really shaped a lot of my thinking about how to write about politics and, being free from, too much of a pre-existing ideology or point of view. Peter and I were able to come at it in a more open-minded way. At that time, Putin was still being very much misread by many of the experts in Washington and other capitals as sort of a Western-oriented reformer, certainly not a liberal. They were aware of his former KGB background, but they really had some, I think, what turned out to be, wildly wrongheaded views about Putin and what he would do for the country. And it seemed clear to us, just sort of covering the story day in and day out, that he was, take a politician to a certain extent at his word and his agenda. And his agenda was very clearly started with going after the independent media, eliminating direct election of governors, launching a bloody and human rights violation filled war in Chechnya, and we saw, I think, pretty accurately what that would mean inside Russia. What we didn't see as clearly, of course, is that Putin would manage to become the longest serving leader of Russia since Joseph Stalin, and that B, he would then turn his appetite outward. And he would seek, not only to eliminate democracy inside Russia's borders, but to be an aggressor in a way that, really recalls not even so much the Soviet Union as the Russian empire of the past.
Real quickly, do you see a way out?
Look, I mean, Putin gave a almost 2 hour long speech today.
Yeah, I saw a tweeted photo of all of his senior officials falling asleep.
Yeah, it would seem like a long, and pretty news-free speech. But the message here was, this isn't ending anytime soon, and prepare for a long haul. He has succeeded in militarizing Russian society. We tend to focus on his weaknesses here, and it's true that the Russian military performance in Ukraine is amazing. I mean, you would not have expected how poorly they had done a year ago. At the same time, it has also played to Putin at least his short-term advantage. He's managed to crack down in a way that would have been hard to do before the war. 1 million potential regime opponents have left Russia, which weakens perhaps the society but strengthens the government. And I think that Russia is a big country. There are more Russians than there are Ukrainians, and he is betting on time as his ally. I definitely agree with those who believe that the war will not come to a definitive end as long as Putin remains in power. And if you're envisioning some sort of a, kind of treaty signing on a battleship, a la World War II, remember that that came at the end of unconditional defeat. Uh,
I just think it's a really interesting answer because I feel like the conventional wisdom among the chin stroking crowd is that, well, all wars end and all wars end with a negotiated settlement, and this one
Yeah.
will too. And I take your contrary response very seriously. Please, yes, and I'm gonna get a microphone to you. Please introduce yourself to Susan real quickly and keep your questions short. Okay, yeah. Instead, just please, I'm going to go to you first, please. Just tell me your question, and I'll repeat it for the web audience. I'm sorry. I'm going to go with this lady here, and then I'll come to you, sir. Please. Welcome. Mm. I love your comment about in real life. That's funny. I'm just very briefly for our web audience. Why is the list of Democratic contenders so diminished? And is there a dark horse list that we're not talking about?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. The answer is really very simple. It's Trump, 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 and that is Biden's rationale for his candidacy. I'm the only person who beat Donald Trump, and I'll do it again. And that
It's a
there's
good
no
argument,
and
right?
that there's no obvious heir, who can make a compelling case for that. And they're worried about division. That they look at history and that suggests that division within a party is the precursor and the prerequisite for defeat in a general election. And so I think it's all about Trump in many ways. If Biden becomes ill or incapacitated or just decides he can't run in the end, that's a possibility. You would see a very long list. So it's not that there aren't Democratic candidates. In fact, I actually think, and there are many people who think, that it would be important and good for the party to have a robust and open uh, uh, presidential primary. But the consequences for the country, I mean, the human instinct to normalize is so overwhelming, right? And I still, in many ways, I actually believe for all the coverage that it's gotten, we haven't talked about it yet today, but January 6th is a pretty transformative and enormous event for the country. And in many ways, I think we haven't fully grappled with this. We are not talking about, the political world of 1992 anymore. We're not talking about, well, it's not what I'd like in terms of, social policy, but I can live with it. No, we're not. We're just not talking about that. I think from the point of view, certainly of Democratic office holders and the primary electorate, right? That the stakes are actually existential, and that has had an effect, I think, on why we're seeing this.
Could I infer from your comment that we would see that dark horse list sort of exists existentially, but we're only going to see it if the president, for some reason, is out of the picture?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're going to see a ton of
or,
people,
or decides not to run.
Yeah, and that could happen.
Yeah.
Although the real nightmare scenario for Democrats, which people aren't really talking about that much, is like what happens if Biden is the nominee and they go through the whole thing, they have a convention, and then in September of 2024, something happens to him, or he becomes sick or he can't run. Uh, then you're looking at a real potential crisis moment. But if he didn't run in time for there to be a primary, you'd see a ton of people. I mean, the governors, I'm sure some of them would get in, Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, they would be fighting it out, J.B. Pritzker. You'd have senators again. You'd have a long, long list of people in addition to Harris, Pete Buttigieg. It would be a pretty robust race.
I think you make a great point, which that in fact there is a list, and it's a good list. Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
So if I could summarize for the web audience, the observation is that the vagaries of the Electoral College not only are incredibly important, but are not being adequately explored or explained by the political media.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that is what's driving again, why Biden has sort of managed to consolidate the party behind him for another run, despite his age, despite polls that show that there's one thing that Americans agree on across the board, which is that they don't want a rerun of Biden and Trump, and yet for very different reasons, that's exactly what they may get. So I actually think that is the reality, more or less, that's reflected where we are.
Please. Uh,
Good question.
yeah, and we could take an hour on that, but before the web, how do you make sense of the world given all of the obstacles to doing that
Yeah, it's a
successfully?
great question. I mean, so one thing is the exercise of this particular column, that I've been doing is in part to first of all take seriously, what politicians themselves, what the presidents are doing and saying, because they are an often understated factor. We all know by now in hindsight, but it wasn't apparent at the beginning of the Trump presidency. Yeah, pay attention to the tweets because Trump would use it to show, the sort of bogus spin of his advisors or his official uh, pronouncements from the White House, and then you'd have the president saying, "No, actually, like here's what I'm going to do." We found that, by the way, as a form of Kremlinology when we were covering Vladimir Putin in Russia at the beginning.
Literal
Yeah,
criminology.
literal Kremlinology, and if you paid attention to that, Putin's agenda was quite clear. This guy first said in 2004, the breakup of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, notwithstanding all the other catastrophes of the 20th century. That was something real. When there were hundreds of children who were massacred in the Beslan school incident, Putin used that tragedy, which largely was brought about, by the way, by the mishandling from his own security forces. He used that tragedy to cancel democratic elections for governor across all of Russia. And, that was a really important, way of understanding things. I didn't need a sort of secret informant in the Kremlin, to offer that to me. I do think that it's really hard to do that. I find myself personally drawn more and more to history. And I do think that, America has always been a kind of ahistorical, kind of looking forwards, not looking back kind of a place. But certainly when you're talking about some of these debates over foreign policy and America's role in the world, there are cycles to them. And it's really helpful. I'm reading this book right now that our friend Bob Kagan wrote. Many people don't like him because they don't like his politics, but as a historian, he's really first rate. And I have to tell you, if you look at this and you see it wasn't just in World War II in the run up to it that people were talking about the clash between democracies and autocracies. It was during World War I and in the run up to America's entries. That was the explicit framing, which is, of course, exactly what you're hearing from Biden today. And I think there's a lot of echoes that we miss in our rush to sort of always look to the next 10-minute news cycle.
Let me toot Susan Torn for a moment. She told you earlier one of her techniques, which is to listen, right? And that's I don't know what I'm searching for the right word, but not everyone does it. I guess is what I'm saying. By the way, I'm sort of fascinated by the books that Washington journalists read. Susan noted recently that her husband Peter read 125 books about Trump and those around him. as the build up to their book, and knowing
You
the
don't
two
have
of
to
you,
read most of them,
and
trust
knowing the
me.
two of you, I don't think you were kidding about that.
Oh no, we weren't kidding. I mean, we felt that it was important, and there's always something. By the way, in
Yeah.
one of the things we did for the Divider was to mine many of those books. I mean, like there's a fantastic anecdote that's one of my favorite quotes in the book, and our friend Brian Stoessel here will know the one I'm talking about. Trump's former assistant, Madeline Westerhout, who was actually fired at one point because she said something inappropriate about one of Trump's daughters at an off-the-record dinner with journalists. She wrote a book. You definitely don't need to read it, but gosh, there is a great anecdote there that became a chapter title in our book. Early in the presidency, Trump is on the phone, I believe, with Ivanka in the Oval Office, and Madeline Westerhout comes in and she says, "Oh well, Rupert Murdoch is on hold. Should I tell them that you'll call him back?" And Donald Trump goes crazy and he gets all upset and he says, "Never, never put Rupert Murdoch on hold," even when he's on the phone with his daughter. So
Please, right here, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
My question goes back to pointed at Washington conflict. 2016 conflict was a pretty scathing indictment of the political establishment that includes politicians, but also journalists, think tanks, and if you have read those newsletters since then, political playbook and whatnot, still very much seems like the same way of talking about the political establishment, who's who, or who has spotted where, who's ambassador's president. And it just makes me wonder, and I want to get your take on this. I think there's been a lack of self-criticism and self-reflection of the Washington establishment post-Trump, or do you?
For the web, has the Washington political establishment, in your estimation, done an adequate job of self-criticism and self-reflection, given that it, along with everyone else, apparently missed the Trump phenomenon?
it's kind of hard to unpack that, right? Because there's so many different, there's no one monolithic, kind of Washington media, and there are different roles and different goals for all of this. Washington is a company town. Like Adam covered Silicon Valley, right? It's the same kind of thing. Like information is a lubricant. It makes a city like this work. That is the mission of many of those publications you mentioned, Politico Playbook or Punchbowl News. Their job isn't really to go out and tell you what the pulse of America is.
Mm.
It's not really to predict the outcome of the election. What their job is to tell you is like, who's that new power broker now that there's a new Speaker of the House? Who are the five people who matter in that office? Which up and coming TV star is getting all the scoops on the White House beat? Like that's the kind of information that's a commodity in any company town, and Washington is a company town. So that's an important mission, for those publications. And I actually think, they do a remarkably good job of it. The problem is it leaves people like me kind of drowning in too much, little bits and pieces, and it can be hard to discern, what really matters. But to the bigger picture question, which is a very important question, um, the amazing thing about Washington is that it's often wrong, and Trump is one really acute example of that because it had terrible consequences for our democracy, and he waged a purposeful assault. By the way, on the institutions of government, that wasn't just something that started on November 3rd, 2020, or on January 6th, 2021, but from the beginning of his presidency. And many people in that sort of Washington world that you're talking about, they were wrong. Forget about whether they were wrong about the election. Let's just stipulate that, maybe that wasn't their job. Many of them were wrong as well on understanding. They thought that Donald Trump would be constrained by the adults in the room, or they thought, don't pay attention to the tweets. This was actually the counsel that was given to many foreign officials. I know this firsthand from many very senior and experienced and smart Washington fixtures. They were wrong about that. You should pay attention to the tweets because it told you a lot about the agenda. It's not a particularly self reflective place, and in part because as much as it screws up, remember that it's a city that's built on the basic knowledge and principle that in 2 years or 4 years or 8 years, these people will be gone, and
And we'll
and
still,
we'll still be
yeah.
here, and
Uh,
we'll still be here.
and you didn't ask it, but the media, in particular the New York Times, was extremely self-critical of its performance. Brian Stelter can comment on how sincere that is, but they at least said so. That's not the Washington establishment, which is what your question was. Please. So the question is, comment a little bit more about the state of local media, and is Washington journalism any solution to the problem?
I think that actually it's not. And one of the, I mentioned at the beginning the kind of crisis in local journalism and the disappearance of so many outlets. At the same time, there's more and more Washington coverage, but it's not necessarily more and more Washington coverage of the kind that individuals need in their cities and states and communities. And I do think that, when I first, was coming in as a journalist, and I was writing for roll call, so for an audience of insiders, actually members of Congress themselves were the main audience of our publication. But there were places like state news, and there would be so many local and state newspapers that would have their own bureaus in Washington, and those have disappeared largely. Just like, and that of course means that the Texas Press Corps is withered away in Washington, so they're not writing stories that have the most direct impact
Like
on their
about the
state.
Texas delegation, for example. And
Absolutely,
that's not what
absolutely.
Punchbowl is going to do.
No, that's exactly right. So we have more information about a smaller number of players and from a smaller perspective than possible. It's Washington writing for a Washington audience, or for a national audience, or for an audience, if you pay for it, of healthcare lobbyists, or for an audience of energy lobbyists, or for and so specialty subjects are quite well represented now, and there's a robust amount of news and journalism and accountability that flows from that. But again, I see that the crisis in local journalism is also a crisis in national news that matters for communities.
I want to share an anecdote since we're on the subject of journalism. Last spring, I was at a cocktail party with a bunch of journalists, and I said, I happen to think we're in a golden age of journalism right now. And a friend of mine just chewed me out for saying that. And I realized why I had said it, which is because there's a ton of jobs in Silicon Valley for tech journalism.
Right.
It's analogous to what's going on in Washington. And I was right, but for what I meant, but he was right. Now, still, I'm somewhat optimistic. Local journalism has died, so to speak, for some reasons that have nothing to do with ideology. The business model was terrible, and so it's gone away. But there's a lot of green. I still believe there's a lot of green shoots happening, whether it's through nonprofits or alternative business models like Axios Local, just to choose one. And I just like your take on that. And then I think we've already run over. We'll wrap after that.
Yeah, so that's an important question about, is there a revitalization that's possible? I do see some very promising nonprofit journalism models for local and state coverage. There's places like the Texas Tribune in Texas as a model that's out there. There are other communities that are served by that. But I feel like it's a race against time too, because I think it is reflected already in this crisis in our politics. And I really was struck. I'm sure many of you were as well. Comment by Marjorie Taylor Greene yesterday. She said, "Let's just get a divorce. Let's just get a divorce." And easy to dismiss her as sort of a cartoonish figure, if not for the fact that she is clearly ascendant, at least in the House Republican conference. But here's the thing: that reality of separate blue Americas and red Americas, what I've seen is that this trend towards fragmentation is accelerating rather than decelerating. If you look at what happened since Roe versus Wade was thrown out by the Supreme Court, we're actually moving toward a world from de facto separation between the realities, the societies and the laws and the politics in blue America versus red America. We're actually now going to a sort of de jure and not just a de facto separation between these different parts of the countries. And of course, that's accelerated by a politics in which Republicans play to the most extreme elements of their Republican base in order to get elected, and Democrats play to an extreme element there. I was, reviewing prize submissions for an award recently, and I have to say one of the most interesting ones I just read the other day was from a very red state, which has a dynamic that will be familiar to you of, democratically run cities, blue dots essentially in the red sea of this particular state. And the gridlock and dysfunction and the horrible consequences for the people of that city that I was reading about, it really just hit home to me. This thing about our politics being broken is not an abstraction. It's actually a reality in a lot of the country today. And this newspaper had done a pretty good job of reflecting it, but I couldn't help but think that honestly, part of the problem was that they probably hadn't done a really good job over the last 20 years at holding those politicians, both the blue politicians and the red politicians, to account.
I mightily wish we could have ended on a higher note than that, but this is the world that we live in. Before I thank Susan, I want to tell you that my next speaker in this series will be Sarada Perry, who was a senior speechwriter to President Barack Obama and a graduate of the Kennedy School, I believe. And that'll be on March 6th in the early evening. Susan, thank you so much for spending your incredibly valuable time with us this afternoon. Not only are you incredibly knowledgeable, but unlike some people in Washington, you answer the question and you answer it deeply. So please join me, everyone here and on the web, thanking Susan.
Thanks for coming, everybody.